We're very excited to bring you a series of short videos where we will be dissecting the 2023 Florida Realtors and Florida Bar As-Is residential contract for sale and purchase, also known as the FAR Bar As-Is 6X. Let's get it closed. For our first episode, we will focus on the most fundamental part of the contract, the parties to the transaction, specifically line 1, the seller. When drafting a new contract, it is crucial to accurately identify the current property owners. We receive executed contracts much too often with inaccurate or incomplete seller's information. Ensuring the offer is correctly signed by all current owners of record is vital to a solid foundation. Where do you go to identify who are the current owners of a given property? Many agents rely on MLS, tax collector, or property appraiser websites. While those sources offer a good start, we find that the best way to confirm property ownership is by obtaining a copy of the latest deed found on the county recorder's portal and aligning it with the property appraiser's records. Let's take a look at a few mock examples. When looking at the deed, we're looking for the grantees or the parties to whom the property is being transferred or granted to. When the property is owned by an individual or a husband and wife. In our first scenario, the deed identifies the grantees John Doe and Jane Doe as the current owners, matching the appraiser's information. I wish every case could be this simple. Here, the property appraiser records show Jane Doe as the owner, while the current deed names both John Doe and Jane Doe. Why do you think this is? Sadly, it may be that John has passed away and Jane had a death certificate recorded in the public records, which would explain why he was removed as an owner from their records. When you fill out the seller's line of the contract in this scenario, it's okay to write in Jane Doe's name only, but do let us know that John is deceased when you send in the contract. Or you may write in John Doe, in parentheses, deceased, and Jane Doe. Another reason could be due to a divorce. Take a look at the property appraiser's records here. It reflects Jane Smith as the property owner, but the deed shows John Doe and Jane Doe. Now that is completely different. Is the property not owned by Jane Doe? Not necessarily. In this case, it is important to inquire with Jane or their agent. As it turns out, John and Jane got divorced, and Jane decided to change her name back to her maiden name and had the records changed. Jane Doe and Jane Smith are one and the same person. Under the circumstances, the seller section should be written as Jane Doe NKA, or now known as Jane Smith. Here, the property appraiser's portal might name some but not all of the owners, followed by the words et al., Latin for and others. It is essential to refer to the latest deed to ensure all grantees are included in the seller's section of the contract: John, Jane, Ralph, and Mary Doe in this case. Remember, all people or entities in title must be named in the contract and must sign the contract. If you rely on property appraiser's records and ignore the et al. Notation, Mary would have been omitted and the contract will need to be corrected. This may reset the effective date and delay the closing, or worse, it could give rise to the buyer or seller canceling the contract because, after all, it isn't valid without the signature of all owners of record. And of course, there are scenarios where the property may be owned by an entity such as an LLC, a corporation, or a trust. This will require further documentation to be reviewed in the form of company documents or a copy of the trust agreement to determine who is authorized to sign on behalf of that entity. In this case, the seller should be written as Doe Investments LLC, and the contract should be signed as John Doe Manager. Here, the seller line can be filled in as the John Doe Living Trust and the Jane Doe Living Trust. Each individual trustee must sign and initial the contract adding their title trustee or successor trustee after their signature. Lastly, if you're dealing with the seller directly, you should ask to see a valid picture ID to verify the legal name and the spelling. You may discover, for example, that the deed shows the grantee as Joe Smith, but the seller's ID reflects Joseph Smith. As long as Joe Smith and Joseph Smith are one and the same person, you would just notate the seller's information on the contract as Joe Smith, aka also known as Joseph Smith. Checking the seller's ID is also important to make sure the persons you're dealing with are who they say they are. I am sure you have heard about the many cases of fraud in our area where someone may be impersonating the property owners. This happens much too often with vacant land. We actually came across such a situation not too long ago, but thankfully caught it before closing. So it is critical to stay vigilant. Did you think I was kidding when I said we would be dissecting the contract? You can see how complex just line 1 alone could be. But don't worry, if things are not that obvious, we got your back and will alert you early on if there's something to be clarified or corrected. With a solid foundation in the form of a well-written sales contract, we will now need to build a solid roof so that we may bring the transaction to a successful closing and provide the buyer with protection over their investment. When we receive a new contract in our office, we conduct a thorough verification process. This involves not only confirming that the seller information and signatures align with online ownership records, but also uncovering any potential hidden interest in the property. Early on, we request certain documents from the sellers for our review, such as IDs, company papers, trust agreements, divorce settlements, death certificates. This helps us identify who is required and authorized to sign the contract and transfer the property to the buyer. We aim to uncover details like a spouse who may not be on title, but who may have an interest in the property if we're dealing with a primary or homestead residence. Our responsibilities extend further. We will then perform a comprehensive investigation of the chain of title to identify any additional parties with an interest in the property. This process ensures clarity on who must sign the deed or any required releases for a clear transfer of title to the buyer. As we conclude, we invite you, our viewers, to actively engage by sharing experiences you may have had when trying to identify a seller to a transaction. And remember, we are here to assist if you have any questions when trying to identify who are the current owners of record or with anything you may need when writing up a contract. Thank you for joining us. Please like and subscribe to our channel and please share. Let's get it closed.